Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including Dakota land ceded under force in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The History Department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate, the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. I would add that we also acknowledge communities that neighbor our campus here in the Twin Cities. So I'm Sarah Chambers. I'm the current chair of the History Department, and it's really wonderful that you are joining us this evening for a discussion of an excellent book for the opening of this academic year's History Book Club. I want to thank Amanda Nelson, who is managing things behind the scenes. And we'll have about a half an hour or so of conversation with our two co-authors here today, and then the opportunity for you all to ask questions as well. Anytime a question comes to you, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, and then I will read those out as we move towards that part of the event. So it's really a great pleasure to welcome back these two authors who have been with the book club before. David Perry, who both did his PhD in our department, and after starting his career at Dominican University, we were able to recruit him back to serve as our Associate Director of Undergraduate Studies. And his co-author, Matthew Gabriele, who's Professor of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech. So they first published together the smash hit, The Bright Ages, which reshaped many readers' understanding of the Middle Ages. And in chatting here before we came on, I found out it's been translated into 9 languages, and they've just signed a contract to publish an edition in Ukrainian. So very relevant there. And so now they've collaborated on a second book in medieval history that is both outstanding history and also great storytelling about the Carolingian dynasty of the Franks. It's entitled Oathbreakers, The War of Brothers That Shattered an Empire and Made Medieval Europe, published by HarperCollins. So I'm going to turn things over to Matthew and David to tell us about the book, and then we'll proceed with a discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to the University of Minnesota for having us back. I'm Matthew Gabriele. Hello. From Virginia. It is lovely to be here again. We did this same event for the Bright Ages a few years ago, and I was jumped at the chance to do this again. I thought I'd start by just kind of giving a little bit of an overview of the book itself, talking a little bit about kind of how it came to be very briefly, and then about what the book is about, and then I'll turn it over to David, and he could talk a little bit more about kind of set pieces and some of the kind of key moments of the book and kind of how we went about talking about them and why that kind of matters, I think. So as Sarah mentioned, The Bright Ages is a big book. It covers at least 3 and really kind of 4 continents across more than 1,000 years of history. It kind of moves by vignettes across all of the medieval world, trying to tell a coherent story about how we can know something about this period that we think of as the Dark Ages, right? Darkness kind of coming in the original metaphor from the inability to know anything about this period. We know a lot about antiquity, and we know a lot about modernity, and there's this kind of darkness in between. And so the metaphor of the Bright Ages is about illuminating. And so for the next book, we kind of struggled a little bit afterwards, just trying to figure out exactly what we wanted to focus on. And so we made this a little bit more narrow, taking a set piece from one of those chapters and then really expanding it. Because in the midst, right in the middle of the book, we talk about this civil war that happens in the 9th century. and a bunch of really wonderful sources that we have from this period. But ultimately, that would lead to some really catastrophic changes in the way and the kind of the shape of European history well into modernity. And what I mean by that is that it kind of set, or at least it was believed in the 19th and early 20th century, that this was the moment in which France and Germany were born. The Civil War was something that divided Europe into what we now think of as France and Germany. So I thought I'd start with just a little bit of a reading, and this comes from the epilogue. Okay, it's the beginning of the epilogue. So we start at the end, and then we'll go back from there. So Today, the fields around Fontenoy unroll before you in soft, undulating waves. The farmland is abundant, and the region is peaceful, quiet. In April and May, fields of flowering rapeseed paint the landscape yellow, while in other well-organized fields, thousands of sunflowers stretch their colors towards the sky. A few small stone houses can be seen in the distance, connected by a smattering of 1- and 2-lane roads that crisscross the flatland. If you climb one of the gentle rises, you can see for miles in almost every direction. Few remnants of the 9th century landscape remain. The town of Fontenoy hosts a small museum alongside a restaurant, butcher, and a small church. To the south, the wooded Bois de Briotte, where the first action of this battle at Fontenoy occurred, still stands, albeit in much shrunken form. The hamlet of Solmay, where Nithard fought, is to the southeast, now little more than a lane flanked by some quaint stone houses. The brook of the Burgundians meanders lazily off a bit to the east. And if one drives slowly south out of the town along the Rue de Corbier, the road slowly climbs to a lovely vantage point. And at that crest, as the countryside expands to the horizon, next to the road, surrounded by low hedges, stands a simple gray stone obelisk. The Latin inscription at the top of the obelisk simply says, quote, "The Battle of Fontenoy, 25 June 841. Underneath, in French, it reads, quote, "Here on 25 June 841, the Battle of Fontenoy was fought between the children of Louis the Pious. The victory of Charles the Bald separated France from the Western Empire and founded the independence of the French nationality." What this monument is basically doing, which was erected during the reign of Louis Napoleon, the Emperor Louis Napoleon in the 19th century, is trying to create a myth of nationhood that stretches all the way back 1,000 years at that time into the 9th century. And so starting from there, we kind of go back and we talk about what was the 9th century actually like? Is this a true statement? And as you may be able to guess about most 19th century histories, no. Not at all. This did in no way start kind of what would become France or Germany. The idea that there would be a distinctive nation of France or West Francia, as opposed to East Francia on the other side of the Rhine, what would ultimately become Germany, would have been laughable to the people of this period. Because what this was an intrafamilial squabble, a war, as it says in the title of Oathbreakers, a war of brothers. The grandsons of Charlemagne, the great Emperor Charlemagne, the sons of the Emperor Louis the Pious, who fought with one another and other kinsmen, who broke apart an empire in which greedy elites strove to enrich themselves at the cost of the public good. We didn't intend it to be timely when we wrote it, but here we are. So ultimately, what this Civil War kind of did was it demonstrated how fragile these things we call empires really are, and how personal dynamics and the choices that individual people and groups kind of make can really reshape history. That led to this kind of great battle of Fontenoy, this intense kind of animosity among the brothers and among their supporters, importantly among their supporters, because those are players as well, right? That led to a division of the empire, an ultimate fragmenting of this thing called the Carolingian Empire, a resurrection of the Roman Empire ultimately, and led to, things that we might think of as the Crusades, the 12th century Renaissance and stuff. But all of those were kind of choices along the way. So let me pause there and I'll turn it over to David for a minute here.
So when we're writing a book like this, it's one of the real challenges is, of course, there are no real beginnings or that are really clear or real endings. This is true in whatever history you're writing. So you have to make these kind of arbitrary choices. And of course, we don't make it alone. We also make it in conversation with our editor, for example, who is not a medievalist and said, I don't really know who Charlemagne is, and I need you to tell me more. And and I don't really know who the Franks are, and I need you to tell me more. And these can be wonderful interventions, and at least they certainly were in this case. So we have to tell the story, and we end up telling the story across, I guess, 4 generations, focusing at the end with these 3 brothers. But starting with the founding of the Carolingian dynasty by this man named Pepin, who overthrew the previous dynasty in what I was taught, literally taught as an undergraduate, not at Minnesota, fortunately, but in general, but I also have also taught as a bloodless coup, where just sort of one king was old and his family didn't have any power, and so the new family came in and everyone was basically fine with it. That's not true. We write at least it's probably not true. We write at the beginning that this empire that we're telling about rested on a foundation of lies. Actually, we say, like all empires, this one rested on a foundation of lies. And we wanted to talk about a society and a war in which we as historians can see it coming, and the people at the time thought they were on sort of God's people. They had a divine plan. They were part of the divine plan. The empire was part of the divine plan. And it wasn't that they were totally unaware of the problems. It was more that lots of people worked actively to not talk about the problems. There's our best source for the time period around this first quote unquote bloodless coup is an annal. And what an annal does is it writes down what happens every year. It has one job, which is to say, in this year, this thing happened. Okay, in this year, the next thing happened, right? For some reason, the years of the coup just don't show up in this annal. So that's exciting. Then we skip to Charlemagne. So Pepin founds the Carolingian dynasty, more or less. It's a little more complicated than that, but we'll jump forward to Charlemagne, who I often think is sort of one of the 2 or 3 medieval figures that most people have at least heard of a little bit, along with maybe Richard the Lionheart. And I was going to say King Arthur, but he's not real, so I'm not sure who the third one would be. But Charlemagne's certainly in the top 3 of most famous medieval people. We talk about his rule by talking about another coup, a failed coup that his son and nobles tried to launch against him. Again, kind of a foundation of lies, a foundation of violence and potential violence throughout. Charlemagne rules a long time. We move through that again, constantly trying to sort of bring the families into play, introduce readers to this world we're in, because people need to know these different regions, whether obvious ones like Italy, but also Bavaria and Aquitaine. They need to understand the rivers that flow through Central Europe and the impact they have on the shape of the empire, setting the stage both in personalities but also in topography of where the big action is going to come. The big action does come. Charlemagne dies. He has one son, Louis. Louis, though, has many children. Those children rebel against him several times. Louis has a second wife in a moment of family. His first wife dies. He marries a younger woman. They have another child. Well, that younger child he names Charles after his grandfather. The older boys are worried. Is this Charles going to take their place? There is suspicion of this second wife, and her main advisor, or an advisor and collaborator, Bernard. It's suspicion that results in accusations of witchcraft and adultery, and it's an entirely gendered attack that we see lots of places, and it leads to coups. It leads to many moments of at least threatened violence and actual incarceration and some torture. But what it doesn't lead to is civil war. Throughout the 830s, so that's where we are now, Louis the Pious is emperor. He's got 3 sons, 2 of them, in their 30s, one of them in his late teens. And there's all these moments that seem like war might happen, but the armies of this period don't want to fight each other. That's a big step they're not taking. But so they summon their armies, they meet across the fields, and then things other than major battles happen. And I think it gives them a sense of security that you can you can rattle your sword as loudly as you want. The consequences are not going to be total civil war. That's wrong. As Louis the Pious dies and his three sons enter into the next generation, Lothar, the eldest son, proclaims himself emperor, and war breaks out fairly quickly, not over who gets to be emperor, but what is it going to mean to be emperor? It's something a little fuzzier. What is it going to mean to be a king under an emperor? Who is going to control which territories? What does, in some ways, power mean among these three brothers? And they fight about that to really devastating consequences for the next few years. So that's the shape of our story. We end up at this Battle of Fontenoy that is, it has all three brothers are there with their armies. There's actually kind of six major divisions in the forces moving around. The sources are really messy. We don't have a really good military history that just lays out who did what where. And we think that's fun. That's a challenge as a historian writer to tell stories when the sources are messy and then to be transparent about it. And I guess the last thing I'll say is there are a lot of works of popular history, which is what this is, history that is intended for the broadest possible interested audience. And often what happens is the stories get flattened to the historian just telling the story as best they can, but without talking about how they know what they know. Well, we're both members of an academic history department. That's not how we were trained. But the good news is we have found that people who are not academic historians love to know this stuff. They love historiography. They're really interested if you can tell it in a compelling way. Well, I'm going to tell you the story of the battle. Okay, here's why this guy's lying to you. And that there's lots of room to do what I hope is both ethical history, but also really fun and engaging storytelling.
Yeah, and that's one of the joys I think that we had in writing this book. Not that, it wasn't similar. It was very similar actually with the Bright Ages, but in trying to get really detailed and figure out at sometimes like where was somebody on a specific day. Because if you could figure out where this person was on a specific day, then you kind of have a sense of what they were doing and how this other person reacted and what it led to this kind of other thing kind of later on. And so I think, again, just being as transparent and sometimes saying, and we do actually absolutely in the book say sometimes like, we don't really know. Like we can't speculate, or we can kind of speculate, but that's all it can be, because that's ultimately what it is. I think David and I, we were talking about this kind of earlier in the week in another context. Like there's kind of an incredible moment in about 838. So right before Louis the Pious dies, all the sons have revolted against their father. There's been kind of a shifting of alliances. The middle son at the time, this guy Louis the German, named after his father, seems like kind of ready to take over, to step into the shoes as the successor. There's going to be a big council in Louis the German, the younger Louis's territory, to kind of anoint him in a certain way as the successor. And then it lasts 2 days. It's ended early. The sources all talk about this. And Louis the German, the son, immediately revolts against his father upon leaving the council. Something catastrophic happened at that council, and we have no idea what. We just have no idea what. Like something happened. We have a sense not just because of the sources, but of course all the other scholars that have kind of tried to figure out what happened at the what may have kind of occurred, but the specifics of the incident are just a black box that we'll just never kind of be able to get into. And I think that's a lot of fun, and it's also interesting, but it's also, as David was saying, I think it's ethically kind of imperative for us to say that we can't know. If somebody's trying to tell you that they know, like, they ain't telling the truth either. Because we've read the sources too, and we can see what we can say and what we can't say there.
Can I ask a question, because,
Of
or
course.
maybe a comment that you build on, because I really enjoyed the way you talked about the sources. And so in the battle, you sort of tell the story one way, and then you shift the focus and you tell the story from a different vantage point. But what's really striking is also how, and David mentioned this in talking about the annals and the origins of the Carolingian dynasty, that you also focus in on where there are silences and absences. And you point out, oh, when sources aren't talking about something, then you know something really important happened that nobody wants to talk about. So I don't know if you want to build off.
Yeah, I mean the great example of that is the one I already talked about, these Royal Frankish Annals. But I do think the one that Matt was just discussing too, this council, there's just a lot of writing around the council, and there's a lot of
Mm.
writing happening about Louis and Louis. You know, the writer is very excited that they have the same name because they can do really obvious things with that they love to do, and then just everything is shifting. The power dynamics are shifting. We do think that there are other nobles sort of manipulating the situation in order to get one brother out of favorite position and bring the elder brother Lothar back in, which does in fact happen. There's definitely a lot of court intrigue going on, but it's just not talked about. And that's it is not just as exciting as having really good information. I wish I want that information, but it is pretty exciting. And you can just do a lot with it. With this battle Fontenoy, um, it's just as dramatic as anything I can imagine in terms of a medieval battle. I would like $100 million to make a Hollywood version of really just the battle, but I mean I might have to include the love stories and things too. That's fine. But I mean, you know, I want Peter Jackson to make this battle. It's got great characters. It's got, you know, this 18-year-old brother and this 40-year-old brother, and I mean it's got everything. It has lots of sources. There's poetry, there's sermons, there's narrative histories from a few different perspectives, and they're all really challenging sources, and none of them are, you know, I've worked on other military moments where you still have to be very cautious reading the sources, but you have kind of a professional soldier slash historian noble narrating narrating a battle in a way that is at least a little bit reliable in terms of how the troops were deployed, what the ground looked like, who moved where, you know, who approached the walls when. Plenty of caveats in any reading any text, obviously, but these are just extra weird. For example, there's a bishop who comes from Ravenna and is at the battle and is on the side of the losing side, and he goes back home again. He's captured, he loses all of his wealth, he goes back home again, and there's someone who's writing a history of the bishops of Ravenna who writes this incredible dramatic story of what happened, with lots of classical references, and Lothar, the losing brother, gets compared to Aeneas a lot, and I mean it's amazing. But we know that the guy who wrote that hated the Bishop of Ravenna. They were from rival families in Ravenna, and they did not. I mean, we sort of assumed that the historian wanted to be Bishop of Ravenna. It was really mad. Like, that's a problem, right? It's the most dramatic text. Whereas Nithard, this other historian who was there and was fighting, who was writing history with Charles the Bald, he clearly has, and really, he's really upset by what is happening. And so he just sort of says, and then the battle happened, and now my history's done. And then he starts book three saying, okay, well, you guys won't stop talking about the battle. And so but I mean, I think that they're like, he writes such long-winded text about less important things, and then he gets to this battle and he just says, okay, it happened, I was there, by the way, it's done. And these are really enjoyable processes to work through and then try to put the pieces together, and again, to present to you all, present to readers saying, okay, here's our best guess to tell the story, and then say, here's how we made these choices to tell the story in a particular kind of way.
Yeah. And I think in that case too, just very briefly too, that's such a great example. The Nithard thing is the silences, and it goes to your point, Sarah, is that the silences actually do tell us something in that particular case as well. And they tell us the trauma of the battle itself, right? Like, you know, Nithard does not talk about the battle. He talks about the lead up to the battle. There's literally like two sentences or something like that about the movement of the battle and who won. And then his story actually picks up after the battle is over. So he needs to talk about the meaning of the battle. And that's really important. He spends a lot of time talking about the meaning, kind of in a theological sense, about how no one shares guilt for this, which, if you're saying no one shares guilt for this, then you're feeling a lot of guilt, probably. And that's backed up by some of the other sources that we have. For example, David mentioned poetry. There's a lot of Carolingian 9th century poetry that survived. And one of them is called On the Battle of Fontenoy. And it is a dirge. It is a lament in like a very biblical style about kind of the horrors that were witnessed on that day. Like those are things that I think speak kind of well beyond what they're actually saying. And I think that those are places that we try really hard to bring out the richness of the lived experience, that these were people who experienced these things, even though it was what, 1200 and more years ago.
That's one of the connecting points for us between this book and the Bright Ages and hopefully future projects. We want to tell human stories. We want to tell stories about people as humans who are connected to broader worlds. And this story is in some ways geographically very bounded, and chronologically bounded. Really, we're focusing on, I don't know, 15 years, and set in a framework of about 100 years, at most 100 years. But of course, it's still part of the wider world. And there are moments where the wider world makes itself very visible, and there are moments where the wider world is less visible, including, but expeditions to Barcelona, or when the Vikings show up, not both as raiders, but also possibly as emissaries. When the Greeks send a papyrus that actually still exists, and of course they're writing on papyrus for a reason, because they're trying to indicate a certain kind of antiquity to the emperor, right? These kinds of moments where the broader world shows up again and then drops out, is still part of these human and connected stories that we want to tell.
Do we want to jump in with some of the questions that are already piling up in the chat, or?
Sure.
Yeah. So Barbara Wilkie posed several. I'm going to put one of hers out and then maybe jump to Kay, and then we can come back to some of Barbara's other questions. But one that I know, she says, were there sisters as well as these brothers? And I know there were very interesting sisters. So maybe you can talk about the sisters.
Yeah.
I can start with that. Yes, absolutely, of course. So we've been focused because because Carolingian society, Frankish society generally was patriarchal, descent passed through the male line, but there were women that were incredibly important as well. Charlemagne had, for example, going back a couple generations, Charlemagne had many daughters. And one of the things that happens, again, because one of the things that we're trying to show is that this civil war, if you look back at certain stages, everybody should have seen it coming, but nobody saw it coming at the same thing. So one of the problems has always been a transition of power when a leader dies and the child takes over. That is an unclear, really problematic succession, even when there's only one legitimate heir. And so when Charlemagne dies, he has multiple legitimate sons and many more illegitimate children as well. Is that Louis the Pious is the only surviving son. He's the youngest. He does not have, because he's the youngest, he does not have a base of support. And he's not even allowed by his father to be kind of at court. He's been kind of farmed off to Aquitaine. Whenever you're a Carolingian, you have a son you don't know what to do with, you send him to Aquitaine because it's like nice down there and it's far away enough that they won't kind of bother you. So Louis is sent to Aquitaine. So, but what he does immediately when he gets there in order to cement his power is that he exiles all of his sisters. And what that tells us, and there's been a lot of scholarship, Janet Nelson, the late Janet Nelson from King's College, for example, has written a real lot about this, among many others, is that the women of the palace, Charlemagne's daughters at the time, when Charlemagne was very old, approaching death, they were running the show. They were effectively kind of running the empire. They were kind of controlling access to the king himself, to the emperor himself, especially the eldest daughter by the name of Bertha. Very, very important at that time. Berta ends up actually as the mother of Nidhard, one of the sources that we talked about as well. Never allowed to marry, but allowed to have kind of legitimate, but kind of extra canonical relationships, long-term relationships that ended up producing some children. Anyway, so those women are incredibly important, and they're very consciously, like David said, written out of the sources. Everybody knows they're there. They kind of have to be acknowledged, but they're not kind of given kind of the roles that they had, because Louis the Pious, when he comes in, kind of writes a different type of history to center himself and to minimize these women. The other big woman, I was going to talk about, do you want to talk about Duoda, or do you want me to talk about Duoda?
I was going to talk about Judith, but you can talk about Duoda if you want.
Oh, we should talk about Judith too. So you talk about Judith and then I'll talk about Duoda. Yeah.
So when we wrote the Bright Ages, to go back to that, we often would get the question, Boy, there's a lot of women in this book. Was that on purpose? And we would respond every time that it turns out about 50% of people during the Middle Ages were women. So we thought we should also write about them. And I've said that sentence many times, but it remains true. That's true here too, right? So we're focusing on these brothers, but we're really, I mean, we would have had to consciously try to not include some of these stories and some of these perspectives. It is, and I think some people have done, but it's at the elite level. The people who are missing from this story are peasants, because we just don't have the sources. There's a moment in which we talk about the mass mobilization of the Carolingian Empire for a battle that doesn't happen, but it's a huge mobilization, and the two sides meet across what becomes known as the Field of Lies. And I just think about like everyone in the Carolingian Empire would have seen these troops marching and would have had a reaction. But I don't know what it was. I mean, I just like, and because the people who are writing it down are not interested in that. There are ways of getting into histories of peasants and peasant lives and agriculture, but not in the context of this civil war. At least we couldn't figure out how to do it. But the status of elite women is critical. Again, not just to not just because they're there, but because they are critical to the functioning of the Carolingian Empire in ways that are just really, really essential. And problematic. And when it becomes problematic, then the problems become gendered in a patriarchal way. Although when the brothers are fighting each other, the problems are also gendered, but in a different, I guess, a different patriarchal way. But so Judith, this younger second wife, comes in. Matt was just talking about Louis came in when he was first emperor and cleans house, gets rid of his sisters, some of whom show up again. They're not like exiled. They're not. They go and run important cities, or they become they're very important figures throughout this big empire. They're just not at Aachen. They're not at court. They're not running they're not the center. Other people are at the center. And when Judith comes in as this newer wife, she and kind of the villain of our book, this guy named Bernard, who is a military hero, but who is brought in, who's given important position within court, and clearly Bernard and Judith see this as an opportunity for them. They also clean house, but build a kind of resentment that is simmering beneath the surface for decades to come. Judith is the mother of Charles, and something that I knew intellectually, but I hadn't really thought about until we were writing actually quite late in the process. Charles in the Battle of Fontenoy, I think, is 18 years old. His brothers are in their late 30s and early 40s, or something like that. I could look it up. 18 years old, and his mom is there. His mom is there with him in the army. His mom shows up in the sources. His mom plays a role that queens often play, which is when that they're the ones who get to ask the king for mercy to the king's enemies. And this is a pattern we see a lot. There is a moment where Judith convinces Charles to send the Bishop of Ravenna back home. But again, maybe that was just because the guy who wrote the history, liked tropes, so it's a trope. But it's clear that Charles is leaning on his mom as the veteran political figure to guide him through this civil war. And there's another at the end. This is one of the stories we could have kept going with the book, as his mom seems to get sick, and also Charles is getting married. That there's another generational turnover at this key moment. But I actually think in many ways Judith is the most. If I were writing a novel of this book, I would write it around Judith. I would have Judith be the point of view character, just without hesitation. If Peter Jackson calls me, I'll say focus on Judith, because it's just she's just extraordinary.
Yeah. So, and we're fortunate too. The only person, I'll keep this very brief so we can get to other questions, but we are fortunate too in an extraordinary survival. There's a couple manuscripts of a letter, a very long letter, that's written by a noble woman by the name of Duoda to her son, that survives from about 842, I think it is, 841, 842 is when it was written and when it was sent. And her son
that's the heart of the Civil War, those years.
That's the heart of the Civil War, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Duoda is the wife of this villain, Bernard. And her son, because Bernard is a villain, has been taken hostage by the king. And she is writing, and hostages were a little bit different. Like they were kept at court they were treated well, kind of part of the entourage, but with kind of a looming kind of sword over their head. And she writes this long letter basically to her absent young son, who's probably only 15 or 16 at the time, basically saying, like, this is how you survive at court. And it's a deeply learned kind of treatise, but it's also intensely personal at moments. And it really shows, like, you have been stolen from me. I miss you. You are my son. Like, it consumes my every thought thinking about you. I hope you will keep me in your prayers, but most of all, stay alive. Whatever you do, kind of stay alive. And here's kind of how you do it. And it's just an absolutely extraordinary text, and it's really kind of heart-wrenching in a lot of different ways. There's some evidence that her son actually ends up rebelling against the king, and later on, after our kind of story ends, and there's some evidence that he had a copy of the letter with him when he was caught and executed by the king. So there's something really kind of touching about that, which again just kind of reminds you how human these were people, right? That mothers cared about their children, that there were real stakes to a civil war, that it broke apart families and destroyed lives in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Kay Ryerson says that your presentation of women, all of them, sisters, daughters, aunts, mothers, stepmothers, is really incredible, that she's not seen
Thank you.
something like that in Carolingian history before. And she had a different question about can you speak to the advantages of presenting this story in a public-facing book as opposed to a monograph? Because, of course, with your impressive command of the sources, you could have written a really fine monograph, but that's not what you wanted to write. It's not what you did write. So can you talk about that?
I mean, there are serious trade-offs. There are serious trade-offs, and whenever I talk about these kind of books, both of us have written monographs, and both of us now have written a couple of popular books. The trade-offs are real and sometimes difficult. The advantage is I think it's a great story, and I want more people. I want as many people to read it as possible. And so if you write it for not just because of the style of the writing, but also HarperCollins has a different kind of publicity and distribution mechanism than my publisher, Penn State University Press. That was wonderful. They were a great university press, but HarperCollins is just operating on a different tier, has different connections, has different visibility. Also, I really like to be blunt about this, so forgive me. It pays better. And I am not. I'm unlike Matt and other people here. I am not a tenured faculty member. I'm not a full professor at a university. I was before I quit, but I quit. And so this is work. This is work that I need to do to make a living. And that also has trade-offs. And I like to be really clear about it because it's hard. It's hard. We do have, we have footnotes, but we don't have the really kind of detailed footnotes, including like the Latin text or of the sources that were then translating, all the things that secure you in your knowledge and also allow you to cover a lot of bases and go into kinds of details and depths that definitely I was trained to do. You have to put aside. But the advantage is you get to talk to so many more people and tell these kinds of stories. And it's great. I mean, it's really a privilege. I mean, I was not invited to the book club for my monograph. I don't think it existed then. But I'm not sure I would have been either. I might have been invited to come and give a lecture for the Center for Medieval Studies here. But that's a different kind of, the book club is speaking to different people, and I'm really glad you're all here.
Yeah, and I don't think like one precludes the other either, right? I mean, like this is I think this is a work of scholarship, right? It's aimed at its writing style is more open and it's more accessible, and we always thought along the way, again, with the help of an editor, which is another great, I have to say, part of writing trade or popular books, is you work with an editor that actually edits, that can kind of translate and say, like, as David was saying at the very beginning, like, I don't know who Charlemagne is. Most of your readers are not going to know who Charlemagne is. You need to explain that, right? Like, I don't have to do that, and we won't have to do that in
Yeah.
an academic monograph. But at the same time, like, this is we are still using the tools that we have been trained with from history departments, right? Like I'm in a department of religion right now, but all my degrees are in history, right? Like, so I learned a methodology and a way of understanding the sources and being honest about the past. But also, so this is just a different way of communicating that same research skills that David and I have both been brought up on, and we deploy in different ways, for different audiences. Yeah, and I think we're in a place too, and I think this is very important to us as well, is that I don't know if we're in a crisis of the historical profession right now. Like, people are incredibly interested in this country in history, but the value of history as a discipline is not kind of there. So if we, and medieval studies is even probably a little bit below that. So if we can get people interested in it, and then I think we're accomplishing something. And I think, David and I have talked about this at other places. One of the amazing things, and I have to say, the things I cherish most about writing a trade book is when we get a note, and we get notes sometimes from a parent who says, I shared this with my son or with my dad, and we both read it and talked about it. Like, that's amazing. Like, nobody's ever said that about one of my monographs, like, or my academic articles, and they never will, and they never should. God bless them if they do, but like, no. But these books, like, we get those notes quite a bit, and like that, I think that's really something, and that's something to be valued here.
I want to get to a question that Stephen Tollison has put in, but first I'm going to jump back to a question that Barbara posed earlier, because you're talking about now your work as authors and making choices, and then we'll get back to the 9th century again. But Barbara was wondering if there's points when the two of you don't agree on what to write, or what the interpretation is, and what you do. What do you do to share those competing explanations, or figure out which one is going to get in the book?
We open a bottle of bourbon, and we sit down in the same physical space, which was one of the joys of this book as opposed to the Bright Ages, because then COVID hit, so we weren't able to do that. And we talk it out. Usually it's more collaborative, like, I don't know how to do this, I don't either, rather than oppositional. But we do hit those moments where we're not quite sure how to do it. We have slightly different visions, but they're very cloudy visions. If someone has a really clear vision, it's usually great. But there's definitely, we try to, we just talk it out, and we talk it out a long time. And if we have to open a second bottle of bourbon, so be it. Like, we can take it.
Yeah. No, and I think it's never, I can't think of a time where we've actually disagreed about, like, how to read a moment or how to interpret a particular source or anything like that. I think the disagreements we've had, and these are just kind of structural, is what belongs in this chapter and how do we kind of do that. And I'm thinking, for example, not necessarily of Oathbreakers, but there's a moment in the Bright Ages, which I know David remembers, because I don't think he'll ever forgive me for this. Is that he'd written like several thousand really beautiful words in one of our chapters about Matilda of Tuscany, who's an incredibly interesting, important figure in the 11th century. And it
just as good as Judith. She's
just as good as Judith.
Maybe even better. Yeah.
I think what we need is actually an HBO kind of sequential miniseries of kind of women of the Middle Ages. That would be great. 10 episodes each, or 8. I'll settle for 8. That'll be fine. But anyway, about Matilda of Tuscany, and it just didn't fit within the chapter. Like, we were trying to do a different thing in the chapter, and it just wasn't working. And we tried a bunch of different ways. And then I think I suggested, like, we just needed to kind of cut it. And so we had to cut it, and that's like, so it's more kind of arguments about that. And I'm sure there's been other moments too where I'm just like, I want to kind of do this and go in this direction, and David's had to kind of pull me back. But that's also great about having a collaborator, is you work on these things kind of together, and we've been working together for so long, we kind of understand each other's voice. So there are moments when I was writing this book, I was like hearing David in my head, sitting there judging me from the corner with a glass of bourbon, all in productive ways, but still there. So.
Yeah, I can't think of a real disagreement about sources, or about interpretation, or what we think happened, which is funny, because maybe it's just because we've already done a lot of talking before we sit down to the writing. There's just been so much dialogue that Had there been moments where we didn't quite see something the same way, we would have smoothed that out, maybe not without even noticing.
Yeah. No, and I think, I'm thinking back too, like, I mean, the great thing is like we just text each other too. So I think that's kind of the way we smooth it out is like, I'll text you and like, hey, what do you think is going on with this thing? And then we'll kind of talk a little bit about it and then we'll kind of like, okay. And then I'll start writing it or kind of vice versa. So I think those things are more not, oh, I have a sense of where it's going. And then David has to kind of say like, "Ah, I don't know about that." It's more of querying a lot, like the part of the process is collaborative in getting to that interpretation.
And I just want to say it's not just collaborative, the two of us, but one of the things we do in moments we're not sure is we go and we read other scholars. And
Yeah.
I've been looking at the name Chris Flynn here all meeting. Chris is one of our PhDs, is at Mankato, but was an expert in Louis the German and wrote his dissertation on Louis the German. And I am probably one of the few people not on his committee who has in fact read every word of that dissertation, and many other similar kinds of writing of people who really dug into something and we cited it, but who when something is confusing, we just go and keep reading until it's less confusing, or until at least we know if something's going to be confusing because we don't know, then that's okay too. But that's really you never have to do these things alone, or even just the two of us. We always can sort of do the work until we find people to tell us what we need to know.
Chris has chimed in. Thanks for the shout out. But his dad also read every word of the dissertation.
There you go.
So
It's a great dissertation. I learned so much from it.
It's this discussion about your process and your thinking about your audience is super interesting. But I'm going to pull you back to the 9th century because and the book is of course called Oathbreakers, which meant that a bunch of people took oaths to start with. And so Stephen Tollefson is asking, what are the form of those oaths? So can you talk a bit about the form of oaths, the importance of oaths, and then how they get broken and what are the consequences of breaking an oath?
Do you want to start?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so that is a great question. I think that's the first time anybody's actually asked us that question, which is just a shame on every other audience. So you guys are the best. So the form of the oath, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to say. That one of the few, and we talk about one of these moments in which an oath is taken. It's very shortly after the Battle of Fontenoy. It's called the Strasbourg Oaths. It's at the modern city of Strasbourg, kind of in the Alsace region, kind of between, it's in France now, but it's kind of between France and Germany, kind of along the Rhine. And Louis the German and Charles the Bald, the two youngest sons who are on the same side at Fontenoy against their older brother Lothar. Louis and Charles get together and their army, they kind of stage a war games, and then they take oaths to one another. And we have documentation of it. And it's incredibly important historiographically because in a Latin source, all the other text is Latin, it is recorded in both Old French and Old German as well. And it's the first recorded instance of either language that we have. Incredibly important moment. And we have the verbiage of the oath in which, interestingly, Louis the German, so they're on the east side, and Charles the Bald, who's on the west side, they swear the oath in the opposite language. So Louis the German's people swear in French. So the French side can understand the oath that they've taken, and Charles the Bald's people swear in Old German. It's important because everybody speaks those languages, right? Like they're all multilingual, but it's incredibly important symbolically that they're showing that they're committed to one another and they're going to see the civil war out against the elder brother until the end, until their rights are recognized. Kind of basically, this is simplifying a little bit. We don't have a sense like of the kind of set piece, like we can kind of imagine them in a field, like it's said that it's kind of done en masse. So like there's somebody witnessing it. It might have been, David, correct me if I'm wrong, it might have been kind of a call and response kind of thing, in which it was spoken by the leader and then repeated by their men or something like that. And it was sworn almost certainly, though I don't think the source mentions it, but we have kind of later sources which suggest this, which we don't talk about in the book, that there were probably holy men involved, bishops and abbots, and probably relics of the saints that were there. So that there was some sort of sanctification of this process, or some sort of looming threat of excommunication or holy punishment that would follow if they were to violate these oaths. That's
It's
kind
fun.
of one example of the form. So and then let me talk about kind of consequences, and then I'll turn it over to David.
Yeah.
The short answer to what are the consequences of breaking oaths like that is nothing. There are no consequences. And that is the fundamental problem of Carolingian society, is that people swear oaths. They say they're going to do things. They make solemn vows. They don't do it, and nobody gets punished for it. And so you have this ever shifting kind of entanglement of aristocratic alliances, people changing sides even after they've sworn, various people, various brothers swearing to protect the youngest son, the youngest brother, Charles the Bald, breaking that oath, doing other things, and then coming back, and it's all just kind of a mess. And ultimately, nobody can trust anybody. And then poof, civil war. So
One of the interesting things I saw Kay's question about the languages too, um, in in the Oath of Strasbourg is a lot. Started going back to Matt's opening anecdote about the 19th century, that language then has allowed those 19th century historians to say, look, German's over there, French over here.
yeah.
But I actually think, and other scholars following other scholars, that the lesson of that is the exact opposite. It's look, they all had their vernaculars, and they all spoke each other's vernaculars, and it was a very mixed. They 100% did not see themselves as divided into Proto-French and Proto-German. They saw themselves as Franks who spoke many languages, and that was super normal. And you just want to make sure everyone understands each other. So that may be the only major oath in our book that is not broken, at least not early on. In terms of legal history, oaths are really interesting, and it's just funny because I was just thinking about this because Barbara invited me to a legal history talk by a medievalist who is really an expert on oaths, and in fact is my Esther Cuenca is her name, and she's my go-to for when I really want to think about oaths. I go chat with Esther. In some ways, their breakability is useful because they allow you to sort of create a temporary plan, and then the conditions for when it dissolves are always built into the oath. And so that can be really useful, but only up to a point. And then you cross this point, and then oaths no longer provide a kind of legal, or at least quasi-legal, quasi-religious way of binding people together, but becomes very much it becomes a kind of a short-term performance that is often useful in the short term, but with no longer-term way of building stability, even among elites in society, even among a relatively small number of elites in society. Um, and so we just see constant, and I saw Kay's question about the immortal soul. I mean, it's a deterrence in the sense that they have to come up with a story for why they're breaking the oath. It's just not hard to do. That, you promised me this and you didn't quite do this, so now I have to break the oath. I promised I would never attack you unless you attacked me first. Well, now you're attacking me. We all know people can claim themselves as defenders even when they're the aggressors at any time. And so there does have to be a performance, and the performance is important. But it is not, it is not a tie that binds. It is not a useful way of holding a society together in moments of tension.
I'll say in terms of the consequences of oaths and oath breaking that you referred to, all these shifting alliances and rivalries, I can imagine how challenging it was for you as writers thinking about your audience to try to create some clarity over these constantly shifting, and especially when a lot of the characters have the same names, keep repeating. So fortunately you have, Charles the Bald, or, Pippin the Hunchback, or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I mean,
Someone was mad at us for calling him Charles the Bald when he was 8, and I get the point. I get the point, but like, how many Charleses are in the book? I'm gonna call him Charles the Bald every time. Otherwise, you're not gonna know I'm not gonna know who I'm talking about,
Yeah.
right? Like you just got to do it.
Yeah. And so I appreciated your sort of strategy of both sort of presaging what was going to come, and then also pausing and saying, acknowledging sort of to your audience, but let's get established here and sort of recapping, right? Okay, here's we are, here's the players, and now we're going to move forward. And so, I appreciated the way that you handled that challenge of what's a really confusing family,
Yeah.
and the dynasties and the half brothers and the step brothers and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And again, I want to go back to the point that a lot of that is our editor, who is a Minnesotan, Sarah. Um, uh, she, we turn in a draft of the book, and or several drafts, and those moments are almost all moments in which she said, "I'm lost here. I forgot. Who are these people?" And then that's great. We absolutely need Sarah to say, "Hey, please remind us the stakes. Please remind us who these people are." And hopefully finding it, doing it just enough to keep the story moving without constantly, reminding people of things they already know. But that's
Yeah.
that kind of editorial eye is just it makes the book so much better.
Absolutely.
Uh, and now I'm going to go all the way back to one of the first questions that Barbara posed, and it built on what you, Matthew, said in sort of introducing the book, that there's this battle, and in the 19th and 20th century, it's been retrospectively sort of teleologically said, okay, here's the origin story of France and Germany. And your goal is to show, no, that's not how they were thinking about it.
Yeah.
So I think maybe, and Barbara can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, is she's saying, so what's the alternative? What do you see as what lesson we should take away from that battle? Not the origin story of France and Germany, but something else.
Sure. I mean, I think there's many different stories. I think, there's kind of a meta story, which I think David alluded to earlier, that goes through all of our writing, is that medieval history is knowable and it's messy because it's populated by human beings. And human beings make choices, and they could have chosen otherwise. But we can understand those choices if we understand the context, and we can understand the context. So that's kind of a meta thing, is that it seemed from the vantage point of the 19th century, I think it seemed foreordained that France has always existed. It was kind of struggling to be born. This was the moment in which it kind of struggled out of the womb of the empire, in a certain sense. But people there would not have seen it that way. The other part I think too is, as David said, is that well, we talk about in the book, but David mentioned it earlier, is about the nature of empires and the role of kind of people within those empires, is that empires tell stories about themselves. And we can understand those stories, and we shouldn't necessarily trust the stories that the empires are telling about themselves, because there are agendas. And that's not to say that they're lying kind of all the time about everything, but we do need to kind of sift through. And so when an empire such as the Carolingians, such as the Franks of the 9th century, was so insistent upon kind of the natural order of their rule and the stability of their reign, that they were covering for something. And that was that there was intrafamilial fighting, that they took power, that their power was unsteady throughout its entire time, that they were beholden to incredibly powerful aristocratic interests, that they had moments in which they kind of cared obliquely for what we might call the public good, but then there were other times in which that got submerged. I think the best history is just attentive to the context in which the story itself is told, and is transparent about what story you're trying to tell. So what the 19th century was ultimately trying to do with this battle was to say, of course we ended here because we're standing here in this field dedicating this obelisk, so it couldn't have been otherwise. And we're trying to say, like, no, there's lots of other ways it could have been otherwise. And I think the reason that people made the choices that they did along the way are incredibly interesting and important to pay attention to.
And Barbara's corrected me that wasn't the question she was asking. The question she was asking, but I
it was a
think
great
you've answered
question,
both.
though. But
I think you've answered both, because she said she was thinking about how historical events get repackaged for new purposes and why. And so you've also addressed that. And actually throughout the book, it's not only in the 19th century, but in your sources, when you're discussing them, you're talking about a repackaging, like how are we going to spin this horrible trauma of this battle and make it seem that, okay, well, God had a reason for, it to go and unfold in this way and to tell it in a certain way.
Absolutely.
So I hope that that's an okay place to end, because we're here almost at 7 o'clock. Amanda will put in a link to join our next book club, which will continue the medieval theme and looking precisely at sisters in addition to brothers. So on October 15, Elizabeth Quillen, one of our current graduate students, will be talking about her book, Medieval Nuns at War, Rebellious, Resilient, and Rowdy Women. So that will also be a really fun one. And I think Amanda will also put in a link for if you're moved to support these graduate students, both those who have gone on to become professionals and those like Elizabeth who are still working their way through their dissertations. If you feel moved to make a donation, those will go towards graduate fellowships. And then we'll bring back those authors at a future point in the book club. So with that, I want to thank Matthew and thank David for a great book and a great discussion. Thank all of you for coming and posing really interesting questions. And I think even though we're officially closing out, maybe they'll be able to stay on for a few minutes.
Sure.
We can unmute if people want to say hi and sort of greet them.
Yeah. And ask any more
Thank you very
questions.
much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.